welcome to World City. And, it's actually thrilling to be here and talk about something that everyone in this room is passionate about, which is the sort of the ambition and the growth of our urban centres and particularly cities. Just by way of introduction, this topic was thrown at us. We didn't invent it. It was actually thrown at us, and we decided that we would embrace the idea. None of us were sure whether risk aversion is happening. We see great innovation everywhere. Some of our challenges are getting things executed. And I think everyone in this room probably suffers that day to day. Ideas are cheap, money is not around. Steve Cornwall, I'm the sort of global director of Irico, and we run a placemaking consulting business, which is global. We're in the Middle East, which most consultants are, North America and Australia. Joining me is Nadia Levy, although I thought maybe Levi. It's Levy, you weren't sure.
Levy, yeah,
Levy.
thank you.
SVP of Land Use at Colliers, really developing innovative strategies around development and taking a multidisciplinary approach to what is executing at the actually front end of innovation. Emiliano Espasandon, I got this right. The previous person didn't.
Yes.
It was right. Director and founder of PALO Architecture. Emilio and I met in Copenhagen on the World Fellow tour. Has set up PALO Architecture and Urban Innovation Office, combining his global expertise and academic leadership across sort of impactful public spaces and mobility innovation. You're going to see more from him shortly. Last but not least is Guigo Di Tommaso, I got that name right, Northern Italian, partner at Gehl. Obviously, we know Gehl is the sort of founding leader of what we call human-centred design, and he's really pioneering the Americas, really taking Gehl's vision about what that looks like into the landscape of the US and North America. Earlier this year, I had the absolute great pleasure of being a fellow and going to Copenhagen with World City, and it was such a privilege to actually have a week of just talking about cities from one of the world's great cities, and we had the city host us. What impressed me most about that week was what the city was asking. The city was asking a very important question, which is what makes a good life? We can't be designing cities without understanding what that ideal looks like. And it's changing rapidly. I am a Gen Xer, the forgotten. Is there any more Gen Xers in this room? Look at us. We invented the Spice Girls. No one cares. But the ideals of our parents and our generation about a house in the suburbs, picket fence, car, a 9-to-5 job, it's been eradicated clearly. It's changing rapidly. And what we haven't done is redefine what that new ideal is. And that's causing discontent in North America. That's causing challenges with city making. Do we really know what we're designing for? Do we really know what the future of a city looks like? And I think given that cities are fundamentally about people, about humans, we need to really start asking those pretty heady questions. How many World Fellows are sitting in here? There's a few of us in here. It was a great week that we had together, but there were some really key topics that emerged that I thought were worth just reiterating here before we kick off a conversation. One is that ideas are everywhere to innovate in cities. Money is not. So getting the ideas across is seemingly easy, but scarcity of capital and limited capital and ability to take risks with capital is certainly not there. Policy not keeping up with culture and business. The rate and rapid nature with which business and culture is changing, our city policies are not changing rapidly enough. Therefore, we're getting stuck in the politic of executing. No one's really cracked the code. Is Jacob here from Blocks Hub? Is he in this room? No, we were hosted by Blocks Hub. They gave a great presentation on this idea that are we really balancing urban growth with planetary boundaries? Do we have the balancing act right? And we talked a lot about that during the week. And no one has the code for that, and we need to define that. We also talked about the idea that multi-generational changes to the way people think about their ideals is also changing their consumption behaviour. And there is a whole new urban dweller that's really pushing back against consumerism and pushing back against fast consumerism and is looking for ways to live more sustainably. And we haven't really cracked the code of that. And last but not least, unless you're living under a rock, we're in the world's greatest affordability crisis. The middle class is sinking in America. What does that mean for city making? What does that mean for development? And can we be better in providing more platforms for fixing this great challenge? So I'm going to start off with Nadia. We've had multiple conversations. This is like a podcast in real life. We've had this already. But Nadia, we talked a lot about there is no shortage of ideas, but the challenge that we have is that innovation in finance and creative innovation is not moving at the pace with which we're all thinking, and therefore there's a lot of people in this audience who've probably had the experience of inventing some of the greatest urban incisions that they think they can create, but not being able to get them off the ground. In your view, what is creative financing, and what do you think it looks like?
Thank you. That was a fabulous intro.
It's a big question, right?
That was a great
start
intro.
with that.
I wear the lens of different hats. So in my career, I have been a designer. I started as an engineer. Don't judge me for that. I have also worked as a developer on the owner side and in the consultancy as well. And what I have always observed through every single master plan that I worked on, large scale, small scale, is that at the end of the day, we do this whole design cycle. And the way that it goes is, you have this idea, you do your vision, you do your brief, and the vision gets passed off to a great design team who actually starts to execute and put shape around what that looks like. And then you put this value proposition of what that place is, and everyone's like, oh, this is great. This is a great sense of place. I love this. And then what happens is the baton stops there. The design team goes away, and then the baton goes over to the people who actually execute it, the construction people, the developers. And they're both different outcome driven, right? The developers and the landowners, with good reason. Sometimes they're ROI focused, they're IRR focused. They're just looking at the returns, right? They're not necessarily with the head of the sense of place. And so what happens is you have a value engineering exercise, and there's different ways to coin that, but value engineering strips out place. That's what happens over time. And so for me, creative financing is more about creating an integrated process where you're bringing the right people and the right mindsets into the design process. And not only the design process, but bringing the financing at the front end, not a bolt down at the end. And what that does is you're able to interrogate the design as you go, and the designers are able to opine on what are things that we can do, not necessarily to value engineer this out. If it's not going to be bankable, what can we do? Yeah. We can come up with really great scrappy ways to create a great sense of place, but still deliver on what the developer, the landowner's intended outcome is.
Who do you think should be leading a complete rethinking of a pro forma? Because what I often experience is that when it gets into the boardroom, the design leaders get pushed out of the boardroom, and the decisions are made on finance. Should we be retraining finance people to be more creative? God forbid. Or should they be up front and be part of the process of making the decision? Or what are we getting wrong?
I think that the way that we've evolved, master planning, development, has been evolving, and it's at a rapid pace, I think. And what we haven't done is kept up to the different swim lanes that exist within the different milestones of any given project. And I feel like there's a role for an orchestrator who has the mindset of design and understands good design, understands good sense of place, understands the market and how the market is going to respond, but also understands the financing mechanisms. What is the capital stacks? And kind of can pull together what we call the 3 Ps, or what I like to call the 3 Ps, which is, phase it appropriately. Don't just look at the project as a whole. Look at creative ways to phase it. Look at what your assumptions are for phasing, and how can you spread that capital over time? How can you come up with creative solutions where you bring different partnerships in? That's the second P. And then the third P is the policy, and you touched on this with your intro. I think the policy has such a key piece, working with the policy makers on how to bring it all to life. What are mechanisms? What are tactics that we can do from a policy perspective to augment what that financial analysis, the performer, or the capital stack looks like? Because there are so many mechanisms out there.
It sounds to me like you're actually talking about someone who's a complete unicorn, though. I mean, how many unicorns exist to actually run that role? Should they be in the development team, or should they be sitting in government? Where does this leader sit? I mean, we've talked a lot about the role of the city architect. We've talked a lot about finance. But it seems to me the unicorn you're talking about is still quite aloof. We don't know where they're at. Can I ask in this room, who in this room is from finance? 0. So what?
No, one.
No, one.
And how many are frustrated that
Where's
projects
the unicorn? Where's the finance unicorn? Up there, right. All right. One of the conversations we had in Copenhagen is that God forbid you want a bunch of urbanists sitting around talking about finance. And maybe what we need to be doing is having them more engaged in things like this, where they actually understand the proposition of placemaking, they understand how to make communities more robust, and how to make our cities more robust. I'd like to just move quickly to Emiliano, because one of the things you just touched on is that design plays a huge role in shaping our cities. It's often the thing that's actually not quantifiable by most financiers. They can't put a heady value on it. But Emiliano, we met in Copenhagen, and we had the great pleasure of going to neighbourhoods that were being rewilded, where not just creating pocket parks and places for community, which seems slightly out of date with how people use green space, but we talked a lot about infrastructure, well-being, and how the rewilding of cities I'm going to play a video, if I could, just from behind while we're talking about this, is super important. Can you talk a little bit about your views on why urban forestation is important and why the idea of rewilding cities is good for mental health?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Great, Naya. I think there is a moment that we are living that is a lack of design-driven specifics in our cities, and the city center is kind of the most democratic piece of land that we all have and use. And in that regard, I think we are, and in this concept that are coming from 3 different projects, one in Buenos Aires, a big new neighborhood in the heart of the city. The other one is a competition in Market Street in San Francisco, and the last one is in Boulevard Capitol, the axis of Boise. In both, in this project, we wanted to shift this kind of idea of the concrete jungle of infrastructure in city to actually...
An actual jungle.
Yeah, actually a jungle. But to unlocking that, I think there is only one thing that we need to do. Put designers and people with vision and strong vision on top of the goal that you have as a city. If we as a city wanted to have that, we need to have the people right to do that. And that is something that is something that right now we lack. We lack the ideas to reprogram the infrastructure as a place where we can build ecology, and upon that ecology we can activate different type of uses, and there is a well-being part on
I think what I really enjoyed about our conversation earlier was that you're talking about rewilding and the idea of it not being just about the planting of the landscape, right? What you're talking about is the immersion of things like mental health infrastructure, the concept of forest urbanism being about undergrowth, understory, naturally evolving. It's not a manicured park, right? It has some nature to it. And also then, of course, the energy infrastructure. It can create water, it can create power, things like that. In your view, how far behind are we, right, in North America in particular? I know in Copenhagen it was quite evident that that's moving forward.
We are really far behind.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to challenge that as a society. We are like kind of in this kind of stage that we like. And if you cannot reprogram the ways in which the infrastructure is designed, and we cannot, it seems to me that we are dealing with a product, and the product could be the car, or the autonomous system, whatever the innovation we are, but we deal with the object that is the product. And we don't design ourselves the city that we want, and then the product should be defined.
I think this leads me to Gigo and Gehl, because we did have the pleasure of actually going into the Gehl office and having a presentation by, I think, James Thom. I got that right, a Canadian urbanist living in Copenhagen, mind you. And he opened with a really nice idea, which is there is no difference between public realm and mobility, which is, Emiliano, what you're kind of trying to represent here, is that every movement outside of a building is mobility, whether it's electrification, whether it's walking, whether it's private transport, whether it's public. Tell us, given that Jan Gehl really is known globally as, you know, the master of and the doyen and the father of, say, human-centered design, tell us What do you think we need to unlock in cities to really achieve his vision and what you're doing in North America? What are we maybe getting wrong still? And sort of what needs to shift really for us to really achieve some of the ideals that we've just talked about in the last 10 minutes, from your point of view, from a Gehl point of view?
Yes, I think we live in this interesting time where we know a lot of the things that we need to do in order for cities to realize their potential, yet we're unable to bring that change about. A lot of the recipes, and just spending a few hours with you makes that clear. A lot of the recipes are well known, but there's something that makes it impossible for us to implement what we want to see. We know, for example, that we need to change radically the mobility patterns in our cities. We need to increase walkability, bikeability, reliance on public transit. We need to steer away from reliance on automobile. But if you look at cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, over the last few decades, there's been some improvement, incremental improvement, but the results are still quite disappointing,
Yes.
to be completely frank.
Yes.
Similarly, we need, and I'm talking not just about American cities, but actually global cities, to densify, to diversify our sprawling suburbs. But again, if we look at the cities that have grown the most in the US, Houston, Phoenix, Atlanta, Dallas, they've been growing mostly through expansion of outburbs, I would call them, still today, which are monofunctional and very much stuck in a 21st century paradigm.
Right.
So it's not that we don't know what to do, it's that we're unable to change the course of urbanism. And so it is very interesting to look at these exceptions, right? I think Copenhagen is an exception, is a city that is doing something different. There are many others. Barcelona is another great example in Europe. And Vancouver, for sure, in many degrees as well. So to me, the real question is, what are those cities doing differently? If I think of Copenhagen, which is a city where actually I never lived, but I've been consistently several times a year for 12 years, that's the time I spent at Gehl, I created my own little theory on why they were able to do something different. There's three principal reasons. The first one, if you've been in Copenhagen, you will see that there is some kind of cultural project that is going on over there, that is unfolding. And the cultural project is very much about redefining what makes a good life.
Yes.
As an Italian that lives in the US, I see that very clearly. They were able to reframe the good life not as an accumulation of assets or goods, not as a projection of status. The good life there is about having more time, having more relationship, and really striving for collective well-being. So you see that very clearly. I have seen, for example, the bathing culture flourishing in Copenhagen, going from nothing to hundreds of people in every plaza that every day bathe in the harbor. That, to me, is a wonderful example of a cultural shift.
Yes.
Secondly, I think cities like Copenhagen, Barcelona, I think we saw this morning from the first presentation that Vancouver had done that too. These are cities that are not giving up to really looking at the urban form as a whole. They democratize the way in which they do urban planning, but they're still thinking about what is the next urban connection, what is the next key park that has to be placed here for this very reason. There is a desire for city design at the city scale that some American cities have lost. And then third, last but not least, these cities want to be model, and that create a sense of pride, a sense of desire to participate from all of the residents, right? So Copenhagen wants to be an urban model. Barcelona wants to be an urban model, and that desire generate a lot of agency.
We talked a lot in Copenhagen about, and I think this was presented when we were in the Architecture Design Centre, This idea that when we listen to the challenges of making cities, everyone can articulate and identify the problem, but no one has the solution. Right? So if you think about, there's downward pressure on inflation, so cost of living is really high. Certainly in North America, cost of living is very high. We have a unionised labour that has a certain sort of price that they're going to put on site. So there's unionised labour on site, which is very inefficient and very expensive to make happen. We have, of course, policy driven by cities that don't potentially understand the full breadth of what it takes to create a Copenhagen-style platform. And then in the centre of that, we're lacking the vision so often to bring all that together. In your view, and anyone can answer this, in your view, if we can all identify that these are the major challenges in getting innovation to happen in cities, whose responsibility is it to unlock this? How are we going to find a solution to unlock this challenge?
So I will come back a little bit to financing because money drives
That's
a lot
good.
of the decisions
That's
right
right.
now, but I'm also passionate about the design part. I think everyone has a responsibility. The designers have a responsibility to understand the financing mechanisms. The financiers have a responsibility to understand what good design is and what good sense of place is, but also what the value proposition is. It's not just about the value proposition about the land or the building that they're building or the master plan that they're creating. There's a value proposition there for the community. And then the policymakers have a responsibility to understand the challenges that the private sector has to bring this to life and come together and have conversations that are challenging and hard that no one really wants to have or come to the room or be responsible for. Mm-hmm. But be bold and to really make ambitious cities come to life. That's what it takes.
And do we think that, say, Emiliano, do we think that the public and private sector are understanding the challenges put upon, say, private development, so private developers, where, and we were talking about this backstage, this idea about if you have adaptive reuse as an idea, like a developer wants to take a space and do a mixed-use adaptive reuse for, say, an empty shopping mall. So that's what they want to do. All the infrastructure required to make that happen is put upon the private developer. My experience is the pro forma looks wonky when the infrastructure gets very high, and what all they can really evaluate is the return on the physical making of things, the white box leasing, things like that. What do we have to change in policy, and what kind of public-private partnerships need to form to make that happen?
In a way, I think both Nadia and Gehl, I think the scale of the project is something that is relevant, and I don't think about that maybe some idea when you see the city and say, okay, we are going to plan a city plan. I think never works, no? The master plan, like kindly of a city, never works. But if we can define a piece of the city or a portion of the city or some kind of blocks of the city where we can define a rigorous ambition of what is this aspirational goal for the city, maybe that traps some kind of mechanism to provide more and more people that believe on the thing. That is for me something that is relevant to understand in the mechanism of the finance and the idea of the global city as a whole. I feel that, of course, the mid-sized American city has the problem of sprawl and Phoenix. I don't think that are examples of nothing, but if we can find specific spaces within the city or within the boundaries, maybe we can define some places where could drive in another terms, and maybe that is something that we wanted to challenge.
I think what we also see with cities is that the concept of adaptive reuse is a nice ideal, right? Not knocking things down, upcycling a building, all those things, often a lot more expensive to do, right? So often the saving of a building is much more expensive than knocking down and building something new. In your view, and maybe Gehl, you could answer this because we talked about this backstage, in terms of cities having character, making sure the infrastructure is looked after, are we getting the partnerships with government right? Is public and private money working the right way to make that happen? And if it's not, where does the catalyst for that change happen? Does it happen from people in this room, or does it need to happen at the front end of government?
Yeah. Well, I would say, on the question who should drive the process, the private or the public sector, over the years I've become more and more agnostic actually on who should really be the main actor. I think that the focus should be good city making. So we should really agree on what that really means and what that entails. Seems like in this room we are very much in agreement. And then we got to keep the eye on the ball and find whomever is really interested in that particular agenda. As a person who grew up in Europe, I always thought it should, and it only could be the public sector. After 10 years moving in the US, I don't think that
Right.
that is the only solution. And actually, I've been working with a lot of visionary developers that have a very strong urban agenda and want to implement it, and they become the main drivers.
Yes.
If you ask me about adaptive reuse, my mind goes to what I think is one of the most exciting adaptive reuse operation going on right now globally, which is the work of a small group of developers in Mexico City called Reurbano. One beautiful building at a time. They created a project of adaptive reuse, understanding the actual architectural quality of their building and understanding the connection that that building had with the community. To me, they are a great example that a kind of a win-win-win private developer can happen. I imagine things went quite well for them as developers, but those projects also were catalysts for positive change in those communities. In La Condesa, in Roma, now in Juarez. And bit by bit, they create this constellation of little projects that have really transformed those neighborhoods.
Yeah.
This is not to ignore the complex question around gentrification that these projects may bring up, but I think they have to look at as a really interesting example.
Can we, if we think about mixed use as a major sector for private development, so the small mixed use to sort of do city infill, things like that. I think one of the challenges, is determining what constitutes return on experience, because I think return on building is easy, right? So I build a building, I lease it, I understand that. All the public realm components, it's very hard to quantify the value of those things. And I think, we were talking backstage about, the problem with pay-to-play or operations. You can throw a free hot dog on the street and 5,000 people turn up. Everyone's there for the public realm if you're instigating it to happen. To get it to passively activate, where the community takes it over, it requires choreographing that and developing that in the pro forma early on. What kind of radical changes need to happen in the pro forma, right? And how do we quantify return on experience so that we can actually get all of those ideas into the development plan early and not do it as an afterthought? Anyone can
Since you
answer
said
this.
the magic word performa, I think I could always come back to the example of Waterfront Toronto, which I think is a great example. So Waterfront Toronto basically is an orchestrator and a regulating body in a lot of ways to manage Waterfront Toronto. And that governance structure allows them to do a lot of different things. So they're able to take a look at the land and put a valuation to that and dedicate it towards a long-term community use. And that value proposition, right? In that sense, I think that's a acknowledgement from the policymakers and from the government of what's important, exactly. And then the other piece is having those partnerships come to the table to de-risk a project. So Hudson Yards, for example, you mentioned that earlier, took hundreds of different partnerships, and they were all creative in nature.
We've only got, 47 seconds. This is flashing at me, 47 seconds to go. Does anyone in the audience have a question for any of these panelists around sort of challenges of getting things executed at the moment?
Yeah.
Anyone?
How do you design for a more equity urban environment?
Did you hear the question?
Yeah, I can take that one. Well, we haven't talked about equity, but I think that a lot of the conversations on equity are actually deeply embedded in this debate. I think Emiliano, you were discussing how we continue to work on downtowns because downtowns are the ultimate public asset, right? Are or should be, and if they're not, we have to work so that they can become again the ultimate public asset, the ultimate place of social infrastructure, the ultimate place of coming together of the entirety of the community. They've been historically, they can continue to be. We've talked a lot of private development here because a lot of us represent the private sector or work with the private sector. But I think that it's very clear that the goal is a more healthy, more sustainable, and more equitable city. And I am very ready to move on beyond the kind of the old friction between, public sector versus private sector, and create a vocabulary to work together toward that equity goal.
Yeah, and I have to add, I think it's a great question. That's why I think the city center need to make the role of they are building. They are building to be the most democratic place on cities. And it's not about proximity, it's about building great city centers where all the people, no matter what, from where they come, can use infrastructure, equipment, places to stay. We are all in the city center, so because we have different completely outcomes
and there's 400 different topics we could unpack around the idea of ambition. I'm getting wound up, so I'd like to thank our three panelists. If you have any questions afterwards, thank you.
Let's continue the conversation.